Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the Transportation Committee to order. Welcome. And as a reminder, and as we just heard, this meeting is being shared virtually through Zoom for those of us who could not join us in person, and it is also being recorded. Committee members, just as a reminder, please use your mic. That will allow the folks who are listening via Zoom to be able to hear your comments. And today we will start by going around the room and having everyone introduce themselves. I will start. My name is Tara Orban and I'm representing Cook County. Amy?
Good morning, Amy Lee, representing CMAP.
Good morning, Mike Connolly representing CTA.
Good morning, Lynette Cibarella representing Metro.
Brandon Gaber representing IDOT Office of Planning and Programming. Menard Ashif representing the Illinois Tollway.
John Basic representing IDOT District 1.
Chris Snyder, DuPage County.
Kyle Whitehead, RTA.
Good morning, Leon Rockingham, Mayor of the City of North Chicago, representing Council of Mayors.
Jack Cruikshank, IDOT's Office of Intermodal Project Implementation.
Eric Llewellyn representing PACE.
Tom Vanderwood with the Northwest Indiana Regional Planning Commission.
John Donovan, Federal Highway Administration.
Audrey Wenning with the Metropolitan Planning Council.
Mike Clemens representing Lake County.
Scott Hennings representing McHenry County.
Heidi Lichtenberger representing Kendall County.
Morning, Jackie Forbes, Kane County.
Christina Kapkowski, Will County.
Doug Ferguson, CMAP staff.
Cam Adopt, CMAP staff.
Sarah Stolpe, CMAP staff.
Russell Petroviak, CMAP staff.
The entire CMAP staff back here. Laura Wilkeson.
Daniel Como.
John Hodsma.
Alex Sunshine.
Chad Phillips.
Kasha Hart.
Dennis Barber, Illinois Tollway.
Jill Ziegler, Illinois Tollway.
Jessica Abdelnor, King Kendall Council of Mayors.
Aaron Alaman, CMAP.
Brian Larson, North Shore Council of Mayors.
Drew Duffin, McHenry County Council of Mayors.
Joe Serdam with Lake County Council of Mayors.
Daniel Shu, CMAP.
Ryan Peterson, Epstein Global.
Elaine Bottomley, Will County Executive Office.
Brittany Mattias, Southwest Conference of Mayors.
Terry Dixon, CMAP.
Lindsay Bailey, CMAP.
George Rivera, CMAP.
And I know last meeting we had talked about new names and new faces. We just have one representative change, and that is on the CMAP side. So officially, Amy Lee will be the committee member representing CMAP on the Transportation Committee. Doug, thank you for your many years of participation on this committee, and we look forward to your continued support at this table and in the background. So thank you. Okay. So moving on with the agenda, there are no agenda changes, but do we have any announcements from committee members?
Yeah, Tara, I actually have one announcement. I just want to alert everyone, we are in the process of taking public comments on our new fare proposal. So we have a survey. It's on our website. It is live. It is open until August the 6th. We also have been doing a variety of pop-up events and open houses. So we've already did an online event yesterday. We were at Millennium Station and Union Station last week and this week. And the next two opportunities to talk to our team related to the fairs are going to be on August 1st at LaSalle Street Station from 3 to 7 p.m. and August 2nd at Ogilvie Transportation from 3 to 7 p.m. Again, all the information is posted on our website. We do have that survey, and we are looking at making those changes possibly for our October board meeting and into next year. So I'd be happy to have the team come over and present to the Transportation Committee if that is of interest of the group, or as I said, all the information is posted on our website.
Okay, and our next meeting is in September, so that may align with your October board meeting. Okay, thanks, Lynette. Anyone else have announcements? All right, well, I have one. Since one of the times since the last time we met in May, the Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle, along with the Department of Transportation and Highways, we did complete the county's first ever bike plan. So I just wanted to highlight for the members here. The priorities laid out in the plan include increasing everyday cycling by connecting existing bike infrastructure to major destinations, creating a core low-stress bike network, something that we continuously talk about here. So it aligns well with many of our discussions, and it does outline ways the county will build bike infrastructure along roadways, not only under the county jurisdiction, but also working with state, city, and local agencies to make intersections safer for cyclists. So if you are interested in reading or downloading the bike plan, please go to cookcountyil.gov/bike plan. Thank you. Okay, if there's no other announcements, we will move on to executive director's announcements. And Amy will be providing that update on behalf of CMAP and the board, talk about the board's activities. Amy?
Good morning. Thank you. Welcome to the old post office. We have a full agenda for you today. On our agenda, we have a few administrative tip items. We also have our recommended programs for CMAC, carbon reduction, TAP-L, and STP shared funds. And we also have an update and need for discussion on the plan of action for regional transit. So before we get to the meat of our agenda today, I have some updates for you all. Let's start with some legislative updates. Much like all of you, we're here at CMAP experiencing attrition. And so it's really important for us to have you get familiar with some of our points of contact. And so for that reason, I'd like to introduce and welcome Chad Phillips as our newest member. Is Chad here? Chad, come on. All right, Chad Phillips, he's the newest member of our legislative affairs team. He'll be focusing on federal affairs and building relationships with our congressional delegation. He comes to us from Senator Duckworth's office. So we're very glad to have him on board. And then as we work to reconvene the IIJA working group, you'll see Chad and other CMAP staff to help us regroup on a future approach to developing a list of regional priorities for the IIJA competitive grant opportunities. So stay tuned for that. On the state side, the General Assembly passed a $50.6 billion budget. The team has been and will continue to track several bills related to CMAP priorities over the course of session. See here. Oh, a quick update on STAR, our Safe Travel for All roadmap program. Earlier this year, we announced that our region was awarded nearly $5 million from USDOT in response to a joint application to SS4A grant program. And that was submitted by CMAP and IDOT in partnership with 6 of our region's counties. We have now successfully secured a fully executed grant agreement. So we're excited to get a move on with developing those safety action plans with those counties. An update related to our data hub. We're very excited. It is on a new platform. It has a new look. The new hub provides greater accessibility to CMAP's data for all of you, all of our partners, and includes some new interactive maps. You can check it out at datahub.cmap.illinois.gov. If you go there, you'll also notice that we've updated our community data snapshots. If you're ever in need of municipal or county level data or stats, these snapshots really provide a helpful resource to all of you, I hope. So please check them out. Give us your thoughts. We're always looking to improve, but I've already gotten some really positive feedback, so we're really glad for that. This next update, it's a little administrative and wonky, but I promise I hope you understand why I'm talking about it. So recently, IEPA attempted a rules change through JCAR, the Illinois Joint Committee on Administrative Rules. The proposed amendment that they were bringing to JCAR is really unrelated to the matters of this committee. But the amendment was needed in order to comply with federal rules. The reason why I bring this up is because an initial failure to adopt those changes within the federal deadline momentarily put our state and our region at risk of facing federal funding sanctions. Thankfully, the crisis was averted. But I mean to bring this up because it flagged for me just how integrated we are with our environmental partners, not just in sort of that good planning practice sort of way, but more and more as federal policies have evolved, we are more and more integrated in ways that have also legal and financial ramifications. So kind of stepping back from that, that is all to say, I hope in the future, maybe we can have a conversation as a committee around, membership on this committee, making sure we have the right voices around the table as we make decisions about our transportation future and thinking about sectors that are related to us. So I'll just be honest, I don't know the next steps yet on that, but I just wanted to put that out there together with you. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd appreciate hearing from you. Lastly, I wanted to share some insights from our recent UWP committee meeting last week. Over the past 6 months, CMAP staff have been working really hard to refocus our unified work program development and methodology. Some of this work includes interviewing our peer MPOs to see how they do things, developing a methodology for core and competitive funding, and improving our administrative processes. At last week's meeting, staff shared our approach for structuring the core program. We also shared some early ideas on the competitive piece. And we also discussed some of the key insights from those peer interviews. We engaged in a thoughtful discussion, I heard, and we'll engage in some one-on-one meetings moving forward just to continue to get feedback as we refine our proposals. We will share more detailed methodology come this fall as we begin to draft the FY25 UWP, and we'll continue to refine those ideas and methodologies for the competitive piece. We announced at the meeting last week that we will dedicate at least $1 million annually for the competitive program, with a portion dedicated to planning for safe and complete streets for at least the next 3 years. So we'll continue to keep this committee updated as we make refinements to that program development process. And staff are here and available if you have any further questions or comments on that. Anything on that? No? Okay, I'll turn it back to the chair.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. All right, item 3.01 on the agenda. We have before us the draft minutes from our June 2nd meeting. Are there any changes proposed to the meeting minutes? Seeing none, do I have a motion to approve these minutes as presented? Thank you, Mayor. Do I have a second? Thank you, Jack. Okay, the motion is seconded with no changes. So all those in favor, please say aye. Opposed? All right, the motion carries to approve the minutes. Next up, Russ Petrowiak will provide an overview of the FY23 to 28 Transportation Improvement Program amendments. Good morning, Russ.
All right. Included in your packet today is a memo detailing the 48 tip changes contained in formal tip amendment 23-10 and the 223 tip changes contained in administrative amendments 23-10.1 and 23-10.2. Although I should note that there was only one administrative change on 23-10.2. As seen in the memo, formal amendments resulted in an increase of $206.6 million in total project costs for all prior, current, and future years. A few projects that I wanted to highlight. One of the region's largest projects, one of our RSPs, I-80, is ramping up. So they, and so too have the cost. $38.4 million in federal funds were added to the tip, and that is included in the formal amendment. The Illinois 53 Bridge Project, which is rehabbing a number of bridges on Illinois 53 between US 12 and Illinois 62, added another $16.6 million as they're doing bridge work and maintenance. So that's good to see. And closer to home, just a kind of a personal note here. Closer to home, the Congress Parkway Bridge underneath us. That is actually on your formal amendment. If you look through it, you might see that. You might be like, hey, wait a minute, I know that one. The road underneath the old post office is scheduled to be replaced in FY25, and funding was added along with updating the mix of federal and state funds. Administrative amendments added $55.5 million to the tip in all prior, current, and future years. The net change for the total cost in the tip from all amendments resulted in $262.1 million being added to the tip in prior, current, and future years. As shown in the memo, cost increases and new projects comprise most of the formal changes. Administrative amendments were primarily AC and ACC changes, cost changes, and schedule changes, which were the most frequent if you look on the memo. I think there were 75 schedule changes. The amendments, along with the memo, were posted on July 21st for committee and public review. Staff reviewed the financial impacts that the tip changes, both formal and administrative, had with respect to maintaining fiscal constraint, and can state that the tip remains fiscally constrained as required. Approval of formal tip amendment 23-10 is requested, and I can answer any questions if there are any at this time.
And I just want to clarify just a procedural element. Now that your presentation is concluded, I will ask for a motion to approve it. There will be a second, and then it'll be up on the floor for discussion, and then the vote will be to approve will be after the discussion. So with that being said, do I have a motion? Thank you, Mike. Do I have a second? Thank you. Okay, any questions on the presentation by Russ? Jack?
So you mentioned 75 schedule changes. In your opinion, kind of what are the majority of those? It's just construction related delays, or can you speak to that?
We're getting near the end of the federal fiscal year, so projects that are not making the August or September lettings are moving to the next federal fiscal year. That comprises most of what we see going on.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, in our last meeting, we talked a bit about cost changes and projects exceeding thresholds that CMAP has set. I wondered if in the future it'd be possible to see a table of all the projects that exceed cost thresholds and see what percentage increase they're experiencing, so we could better track that.
I guess anything is possible in the future. I will say that what we put out there and what's linked in the memo is the formal amendments, and each project, the change, whether it's financial, schedule, something, work type, whatever it might be, is all there for the public to see. So we need to, whatever we show the committee, we also want to show the public. I don't know how easy, because this is an automated system, that it would be to change and add that kind of detail on a cumulative basis, where we already show it on each project, and it does show, I'm looking at it right now, it does show what the percentage change and the actual dollar amount changes for each project that is on the formal amendment. So we can look into that, but I can't guarantee that we can change anything, because this is an automated process through our ETIP database. And we use a software as a service, so it's not a customized database. But we can certainly look into that and see if there's something we can do.
Any other questions for Russ about the tip amendment? If not, we can call a vote to approve the FY23 to 28 Transportation Improvement Program amendments, 23-10.1 and 23-10.2. All those in favor, please say aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Russ. Next up, we have Kama Dobbs, who is here to give us an update on the public comment period for the draft recommended CMAC, CRP, TAP L, and STP shared fund programs. That's a lot of letters. Kama, tell us more.
Thank you and good morning. As detailed in the memo in your packet, a joint call for STP shared fund, congestion mitigation and air quality, carbon reduction, and Transportation Alternatives projects was held from January to March of this year. We received 129 applications across all 4 of those funding programs. Staff did evaluate the applications according to the methodologies that were approved by both the STP and the CMAC and TAP project selection committees to determine both eligibility and final scoring in each of the programs. These evaluations led to the development of 4 recommended programs, which were presented to the respective committees and released for public comment on July 13th. That public comment is currently ongoing through Friday, August 11th. The 4 programs combined include over $593 million in federal funding for 66 projects. That includes bike ped projects, bridges, emissions reduction, highway projects, and transit projects that are sponsored by the City of Chicago, suburban municipalities, the counties, IDOT, the RTA, and the individual transit service boards. Detailed statistics about each of the recommended programs are contained in the memo. And the memo also contains links to even more details down to the individual scores and the Call for Projects website, which is cmap.is/2023 call for projects, where all of those details are. After the comment period closes on August 11th, the comments will go back to the STP and CMAC and TAP project selection committees for final discussion and program approval on August 31st. CMAP staff will then process TIP amendments to incorporate the committee's approved programs, and those TIP amendments will come here to the Transportation Committee on September 22nd for consideration for a recommendation of approval to the CMAP board and MPO policy for their consideration on October 11th. So if there are any questions about the process or the programs, I'm happy to answer those.
So after the public comment period, Kama, it's going to be approved by other committees and we will see the formalized program come back through the TIP amendment process.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Any questions for Kama? Go ahead, Chris.
Just curious, Kama, I noticed in some instances, the federal request and the recommended differ. So does that mean you've talked to the sponsor and they can move forward with the lower amount?
Yeah, so on the shared fund side in particular, we do actually ask that question on the application. What's the minimum amount that you could accept? So we won't program anything less than that minimum amount that's indicated by the sponsors. The process is kind of, first we look at full funding in the year requested, then we look at full funding in later years, then we go back to partial funding if we have to. So, and yes, we did have to make a couple calls to sponsors to say, you know, it looks like we can get you full funding 3 years later or partial funding in the year you wanted. What's the preference? And so there's a little bit of give and take for sure.
Audrey.
Is there a place where there's a detailed description of the project? In the tables, it's just sort of a phrase.
Yeah, on the call for projects page, kind of as you scroll down, we add stuff to the top of the page. So towards the middle of the page is a link to the full application information.
Every project's full application. Okay.
Yep.
I was looking for it and I couldn't find it. Okay.
Yeah, I can send you that link directly too. If anybody else wants it, say so, and we can send it to the whole committee, or I can send it just to Audrey.
Okay, but the full applications of the selected projects are available online then?
Yeah,
on CMAP's
as well as the
website.
not selected projects. So they're all there together.
Very good. Any other questions for Kama? Okay, thank you very much. All right, next on our agenda here, we have the plan of action for regional transit. Laura Wilkeson is going to be providing an update of the work on this, including funding and implementation approaches. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks. I'm actually hopeful that you guys are getting sick of hearing about this because if we're doing a good job right now, we've been out to talk to many of you or your agencies or organizations in the last few weeks. So I think there'll be some new information in what we're talking about today, but hopefully we're doing a good job of doing our outreach as we move through this process. Next slide, even go to the next one. So as I talk about that, that's exactly what we've been doing in the last 3 to 4 weeks. We've been trying to be out as much as possible, talking with everybody, the councils of governments, council of mayors, talking with each of the counties themselves, and making sure that we're trying to get out as much as possible to make sure that everybody not only knows what's happening with this process, but gives us input. And it is helpful to have a lot of these kinds of conversations as we balance all of the different input and information as we move forward. Next slide. We've talked a lot about the system improvement recommendations, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them today, other than just to make sure that people, if they're interested, that they're talking to us and the staff about the different pieces of information we've shared before, as well as we continue to post memos, presentations, videos on the website. We're hopeful in the next few weeks to have all of those completed. So each week we're posting different information. And you have to remember, we're marathoners here at CMAP, and this is definitely a 100-yard dash. So we are going as fast as we can to get those memos up online, but understand that we're working as fast as we can and still have more to come. So we're going to spend a lot more time today, next slide, on how to pay for it. We shared this information last week with our steering committee. They have one more meeting. Again, making sure that we have this conversation with you here at TC and continue to have the same conversations with our board. I'd also want to mention that Elizabeth Scott, who's the program manager, is online today, and Daniel Como is in the room with us as a project manager. So if we have additional or more particular questions today, we'll make sure we can answer them. Again, as we've gone through thinking about funding, we want to make sure that there's some different principles that we come at this with. Again, the transit system itself needs to be part of the solution. We do believe that there is more robust state support, and I'll get into that today, that's going to be needed. We need to make sure that we have dedicated and stable funding for paratransit. Again, we'll talk about all of these transportation dollars for transportation investments, and then obviously making sure that we have an equitable funding system for the transit as we move forward. Next slide. So I want to talk a little about paratransit just for a second, because as we look at the finances of the system, we know that this is a big issue as part of our revenue package because of the reforms that we had in 2008, that the cost of paratransit kind of comes off the top, and then the service boards have to use what's left in order to plan for service for our region. We also know that this is growing, and it's something that we know that we also support, and not only because it's excellent for our communities, it allows people to age in place throughout the region as well, but it's also federally required. And so I think that this is something that's been important that we look at as we move forward. Next slide. So when we think about that and other support, we also know that in other places, there's a lot more state support for other transit systems than we receive here in Illinois. So as we talk about recommendations, we will be looking at having more state support for paratransit. Again, you'll see that later as we start to talk about the packages. But we do think even throughout the rest of the state receives more state support for their transit systems versus here in the RTA region. Next slide. So we're going to kind of walk through how we've been thinking about this and kind of show you a couple of different packages. So when you think about, you can kind of hit through all of these, sorry. That we know that right now that there is a gap in the current operating system, and then we know that we need to have improvements on top of this before we think about asking the General Assembly for additional dollars. So that's kind of the first baseline. Then we think about intermediate solutions. We're going to talk today about some baseline actions that you'll see in all the packages. And then we start to think again, if we're being tasked to look at the financial viability and sustainability of the system, we don't want to just come up with a lot of diminishing or a stopgap. We want to make sure that we have durable sources. So you'll see in these packages that we've kind of kept them into each of these buckets as well. And then the long-term solutions, things that may not be able to happen by 2026, but we think are still critical for both the transit and the mobility systems throughout the region. I will also note that all of these take into account some transit system efficiency savings and fare increases. Next slide. So as we talk about these three different packages, again, this is our bread and butter, doing scenario planning for the region, right? We looked at three scenarios, and not only what we would get in each of those packages, but how, what revenue sources would be needed. It's also important to note that there's capital costs that are associated with a lot of these improvements. We're not blind to a lot of the things we would need to do would have other capital pieces associated with them. So you'll also see that we've estimated what those capital costs would be in each of the packages, and we'll talk a little about that today. So I'm going to start from the best package, the biggest package, and work our way to our minimal viable. So next slide. Transformational investment. This is where we get most or all of the improvements that we've been talking about, that we've gotten input from the region. But so all of the things on the what you could get on the right, take all of the things on the left. Now we understand that these are things you can move around as we think about a menu of options. There are things you could add or subtract from this, but if you're looking at what it would take to get the kind of system we want, these are different revenue sources that we've been looking at and proposing. I think it's also important to note when we had talked about system improvements, that just the philosophy of you get a certain amount of money and then you have to plan for that amount versus people asking, what do we want from our region? And then what is it going to take to get that? It's a bit of a different philosophy change. So you'll note here in all three of the packages, baseline actions. So in this first one, we talk about increased state support for paratransit. We have covering the half of the cost in the baseline because you'll see that in all three packages, but in this package, you'll also see it in the durable sources where we ask for all of the paratransit costs to be covered by the state. Additionally, the transit boards have mandates on different fare subsidies, and we are asking in this package that the state would reimburse or cover those mandates. Additionally, they also charge us about $30 million to collect that sales tax, and that's taken out of the pot. So we would ask that the state remove that cost. As we go through the durable sources, again, we talk about expanding the sales tax base, which we've talked about here, increasing match, that's the second part of the paratransit, a downtown parking tax, a registration surcharge, and then you get into the diminishing sources as well. I think that it's important to note in here, as we've noted many times before, that there is no one solution. You can see that to get to transformational investment, how many revenue sources that it takes to get the system improvements that we're looking for and to keep our system operating. Next slide. So that's 1.5 billion in the transformational investment. Meaningful change is 1 billion. So again, you start to see the reduction of the revenue sources and some different options. Again, these can be mixed and matched a little bit if we're looking at different solutions, but we also think these are the ones that actually make improved policy change as well as have equitable impacts. You'll see at the bottom that we note what the capital costs are for each of these. And so we can talk again a little about that in a minute. And then the minimal viable is basically a few of the improvements that we've talked about, but basically it's kind of limping along. It's not moving us forward. But we wanted to make sure that we showed this option as well, and that it still takes many pieces of revenue and different changes in order to get just to our minimum viable. The last piece of this is that we also, again, not putting our blinders on, understand that there's capital investments as well, and that we looked at different options and opportunities for funding those. So I'm going to stop there. These are the different packages that we are currently exploring and investigating and evaluating, and would love your input on these before we talk about governance. Questions, thoughts? Yeah, Vic.
Good morning. Laura, thank you for the presentation. In the three buckets of funding you have, I believe they were like stopgap, diminishing, durable, and I couldn't recall the third.
You can go back to the transformational investments, got it all, so.
Okay, thank you. Could you just explain more to us the logic? Like I see as we move from transformational to minimum viable, the logic is like diminishing or stopgap sources are weighted more heavily in the transformational and almost no diminishing or stopgap sources within the minimum viable. So like that was in the original diagram with the bars.
Right.
Could you just explain us more logic how you kind of scaled these three buckets through those three scenarios?
So ask the last
So
question.
the question is, it seems like in the transformational scenario, the proportion of the total $1.5 billion funding coming from diminishing or stopgap is greater. Like the ratios of funding amongst these three funding streams or funding types varies between the three scenarios. How did you guys arrive at that? So like, for example, 470 million, about a third of this transformational investment scenario is premised on the diminishing or stopgap sources. But I think in the minimum viable, there's nothing within those diminishing or stopgap
So I
sources.
think I can answer your question again. I'll let Elizabeth or Daniel jump in too. But where we started on the minimum viable, if we're not going to be doing anything else, we really need to make sure that the sources are sustainable and long-term. So we don't want to start with the diminishing or stopgap. If we're going to put changes in place, we want to see those be things that we can rely on in the long term, right? So there's a lot of revenues that we actually looked at that you see declining over time. So that's not where we wanted to start. And so if we're going to be at the minimum viable, we want to make sure those are long term. So yeah, they might have additional dollars or more dollars to them in the short term. But that's kind of how we weighted it. Again, if somebody wants to weigh in, but that's how we approached it. Other input, yeah.
So under durable sources, the new sales tax state match flowing through existing formulas. Do you have an existing program in mind for that item?
I don't think I can answer that. See if someone's coming around the corner or not. If not, I was gonna say, if you want to come up. I was like waiting to see a picture online or come around the corner.
So that was just using the existing 30% calculation from, so if you were to expand the sales tax base using the existing formulas for the match to that sales tax funding that would flow through both the sales tax 1 and sales tax 2 that are currently assessed. So it was not a specific program, but just using the existing formulas, calculating what that match would be.
Okay, thank you.
And then if it were accompanied with a broader statewide expansion of the sales tax base, that would also generate additional revenue for the state.
So a comment was made in the beginning of not receiving similar support to, I assume, the rest of the state, meaning downstate. Is that just in comparison to the downstate operating assistance program?
Yes, and certainly as a relative amount, as an absolute amount of dollars, we know that it's a different scale, but in terms of the percentage of operating expenses.
Okay, and my only recommendation on that one is if that's something you're exploring I assume you're familiar with it, but there is that 35 cents on the dollar match rate for it. So having to come up with a way to fund that as well. But certainly good stuff. Thank you.
Can you expand on that? Well, I don't know what you're referring to, the 35 cent.
So, and I'm not completely familiar. Jack may be able to
Yeah,
speak. to
Brandon,
this
would
as
you
well.
like me to?
Yes, please
So
go ahead.
What they're talking about is a program called the Downstate Operating Assistance Program, DOPE. Yes, at one point I gave out DOPE for the state of Illinois. What that is, yeah. So the state of Illinois, IDOT, supports 65% of all transit expenses in downstate agencies outside of the RTA region. This is a surprise to many. IDOT supports transit in 101 of 102 counties, so all of them but one. And in all of those outside of the RTA region, 65% out of the state tax funding. Another approximately 10% is in the federal, the 5311 and 5307 funding in those agencies for the small urban and the rural. And so they end up having to come up with about 25%. That's what they're talking about. So that's just the difference.
Match to the 65.
The 65 and then ultimately the 10 as well from the federal. So works to about 25%.
Appreciate that explanation. Thank you.
And
And
that's,
thank you, Daniel, for providing the answer.
that was probably one of the biggest hindrances to downstate transit. It's just coming up with that local money to access the state tax revenue as well. So.
Yeah, apologize. If you look at the state line item budget, you will see that counties across the state outside of the RTA region do leave hundreds of millions on the table because they're not able to come up with that match every year.
Thank you, Jack. Amy?
So through that program, up to 65% would be state funded. What's the percentage right now that the state funds for paratransit in our region? Just as a percentage, maybe RTA
I don't
knows
have
that.
that answer. I'm sorry.
It's less than 10%. I can look up the number right now, but
8%.
8%.
About 8, okay, thanks.
Their input on the different packages as we think about moving forward, yeah.
On the topic of paratransit, we appreciate the focus on full funding for free and reduced fares and increasing state support for paratransit. We think the baseline action should be full funding for paratransit, across all funding scenarios. I think covering only half of the cost of paratransit, puts the region in a precarious position, just slightly less precarious than we're in right now. Because as you described, the funding has to come off the top right away because of that state mandate. So I know there's some suggestion in the memos that, the region locally could come up with up to 50% of the cost. I think that would be challenging, to say the least. So I think, we think we should be asking for full coverage across all funding scenarios. Also, the minimum viable, I understand that, it's not the preferred option being presented necessarily, but I'll just note that it doesn't even raise the $730 million necessary to close the gap. I think there's some assumptions that through cost savings and fare increases, you could get from 500 to 730. Again, I think that assumption is speculative and would be challenging. So when presenting funding packages to the state, I feel like there's consensus that we should close the gap, and so the minimum viable should still close the gap to prevent severe service cuts and fare increases. So looking at this package and not seeing it hit that 730 number is concerning.
Mike?
So I just want to make a comment about paratransit, and there was a slide that shows that paratransit costs are going up. Paratransit is a very expensive service to be provided. As was mentioned, it is required. There's no choice in it. It's a federal requirement that the public transit agencies throughout the country have to provide adequate paratransit service. The only thing I wanted to kind of put this in perspective, we don't run paratransit. Most of you know, PACE operates the paratransit service for the region through the RTA, and the funding does come off the top. This paratransit service that's operated in this region is, I would tell you, the best in the country. It's better than New York. It's better than Atlanta. It's better than LA. It's better than any paratransit system that I've seen across the country. And I've looked all across the country. My office and my operation monitors and checks on paratransit compliance, because we, even though PACE is doing the paratransit for the region, we are responsible to the FTA for that provision of paratransit. And there's a governing group that meets every year on a regular basis to look at how PACE is doing on paratransit. Our on-time performance, our missed trips, and our cost per trip are all very, very good compared to anybody else in the country. So I just want to say it's a well-run paratransit system, and it's vital for our region. This region is aging out, and CMAP has produced, and MPC has produced some information all about what's going on in the region. Our citizens are becoming older, and that makes more and more of them reliant on a good paratransit network within the region here. And that importance is just going to continue to grow in the future. So the need for paratransit will continue to go up. And I think it's important to make sure, and I think this is something that's in the part so far, and it's a part of the consideration, but we've got to make sure that we cover that. We've got to make sure that we have a viable source of revenue for paratransit costs today and for paratransit costs in the future. And again, I think it's crazy to go back and say, oh, PACE could do better. They could cut this, they could do that. They're already doing that. They're already putting in a huge reliance on the TAP program, using taxi access, and they're also experimenting with using some contracts with the ride-sharing agencies to reduce the paratransit costs in areas where it makes sense. Where it doesn't make sense, they're not doing it. They're doing it very, very well. They're doing it carefully, and they're doing it with pilots to show that this will or will not succeed, or will not save us money in the long run. And I think it's a good thing. So I can't say enough about how good our paratransit is, and we should be proud of it. And I also can't say enough about how important it is to us as a region, as a part of our public transit network. So thanks. Sorry for the sermon.
Well, appreciate your insights, and it sounds like from what you're saying that the needs are going to continue to grow for that service. Very good. Go ahead.
Laura, just for clarification though, the paratransit you're showing on the slide does not include the county dial-a-ride programs that are being operated, correct? Those are sort of other services that are out there.
That's correct.
They often are referred to as paratransit by riders, by even elected officials. But that's not shown here at all. No, there's no state funding proposed to help fund those services.
Yeah, we talk about in the system improvements about consolidation and having more additional, so it kind of goes into what we could get piece of this, of like kind of the different components of actually improving those services. And so we use that within the scenarios, but we're not actually asking for any dollars through a revenue source in that way. But it would be, we're asking for revenue sources that would help the system improvements in that space.
Thank you. Audrey?
Yeah, I just, as I'm looking at the three different scenarios and thinking about kind of how this reflects the future choices that we're making and what transportation we decide to invest in, it seems like we really, yes, funding money is always really hard. But I think we need to think in the context of that we really should be looking at an ambitious investment when we think about the role of transit and reducing vehicle miles traveled. CMAP did its recent study of GHGs and showed that VMT is going up twice as fast as population. It's the only sector where VMT is, transportation is the only sector where GHGs are going up. And then I was struck by an article in the Tribune this morning, just reflecting the cost of driving, that the cost of owning a car has gone up 25% since pre-COVID. The average car loan is over $700 a month. And that it is our responsibility to offer affordable transportation in this region. So if you think about $1.5 billion a year to operate our transit system, what is that compared to what we spend to operating our roadway system? And it's a drop in the bucket. And so I think we just want to step back and think about the need to make sure we make our transit system competitive and that we need to make it better so that we can reduce VMT and address the equity and climate change urgencies that we have.
I have a quick question for Scott. What is the current funding for MC Ride? What is the breakdown?
So every county coordinated service is funded a little differently. In McHenry County, it's about a $4 million per year program. And just to be clear, just that the reason I asked that question earlier was because McHenry County does not have paratransit. We have one fixed bus route, and of the people that utilize that fixed bus route, very few live within 3/4 of a mile of that bus route to even be able to use ADA paratransit. So inherently, the 310,000 people use this dial-a ride program because that's really the only option available for them. Currently our program is funded half by PACE and half by McHenry County. So McHenry County funds 50% of the operating deficit, PACE funds 50%, and then we're successful going after RTA grants, federal grants that have passed through the RTA to McHenry County to reimburse us for some of that cost. But nonetheless, the county is committed to $2 million per year to help fund this service every year.
Thank you.
Kyle?
Building off Audrey's comment a bit, when looking at revenue options, I think there's potential to highlight or set aside some of the options that incentivize transit use. And so specifically like looking at the parking tax, which I know is included in several of these options. And then in the transformational option, I think there's potential for tollway revenue is highlighted. These are unlike the other options in that they don't just raise revenue, they also are consistent with regional goals in terms of growing ridership, reducing emissions, many of the things that Audrey addressed. So in presenting these packages, I wonder if there's a way to just highlight or isolate some of those that accomplish and advance some of our policy goals on their own. You know, through the regional plan and related documents for many years, we've talked about the benefits of congestion pricing in many forms, not just a cordon zone, but things like parking and tolling. Many regions, a big portion of transit operations is funded through tolls, right? So how can we feature those benefits when we're looking at how to build these overall packages, I think is something to continue to think about.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things as we approach those too is that those need to be things in the category where we have more improvements, because there, as we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of our region that doesn't have a lot of transit access right now. And so if those are things that we're if we're in a space where we're doing mode shift, it needs to be partnered together so that you have an opportunity, an option to take transit in those areas where we would be looking at revenues as well. So I think that's something we've heard as we've been out and about through the region to make sure that as we're making these improvements, that we're actually expanding service so that people have the ability to access more transit.
I have a question for Laura or Daniel. On the transformational investment, it says on the bottom, 220 million in one time and up to 400 million in annual capital funds. Can you expand on what that means? I'm trying to visualize like what that looks like.
Yeah, so this is, the capital implications of all of this has been sometimes challenging to talk through because, for the most part, we are focusing on the operating gap that is included in this, that sort of was the precipitating event for this whole project. But some of the system improvements that we're talking about have capital expenses associated with them. And some of those, so the one-time ones are things like we've been talking as a region about advancing fare integration. And to accomplish that, there might be one-time costs in terms of changes to fare systems. So that's an example of the kinds of one-time costs that could be associated. But there's also a number of ongoing capital costs. And we know that the transit service boards, like many other transportation providers in the region, have a backlog of capital expenditures. And that is not necessarily what we're talking about here, but there are, significant state of good repair needs. But in the sorts of things that we're talking about in terms of advancing bus priority or supporting Metro's evolution to regional rail or making investments that can facilitate greater levels of service, that those are things that we know would have capital requirements. And the numbers here are big and round numbers in part to reflect the fact that many of those things you could do on different scales at different levels, depending on the interest and availability of funds. So it's really just to reflect that a lot of this could be addressed with additional operating dollars, but many of the types of system improvements that we're talking about and many of the ones that are listed on the right, would have capital expenses that would be required either to put them in motion or, to really amp them up as an annual and ongoing program.
So previously, Laura, like you had talked about the system we want, right? So to get the system we want, is that line on the bottom then is highlighting to get the system we want, it requires a one-time capital investment plus annual capital component of what we're looking at then. Okay, thank you.
Can I just follow up on that? I want to make sure that it's clear in my head because I think it's clear that the system we want, the capital investments, that is for the new, that this dollar amount does not address our state of good repair needs that all of the service boards have. So in addition to that very, very large backlog, you're looking for an additional one-time plus an additional infusion to that capital side, which we don't necessarily at this point have a way to fund that state of good repair backlog.
Essentially, yes, there are certainly some pieces of this that I think would be related to or could overlap with state of good repair investments, especially if you're thinking about service expansion kind of investments. But yes.
Yeah.
Tara, I was just going to actually follow up with something a little more specific because I know, Daniel, you guys are not the transit operators. And so, but you mentioned fare, integration and we've been looking, all of us have been looking and talking about how do we do fare integration and how do we get to full fare integration? And that's going to take an investment in equipment to make that happen. There are a couple of other items I'll just point to on what we could get over there. There's improved wayfinding and real-time information. So what does that take? Well, every rail station that we have or Metro has electricity, has plugs, has 110. So we have power. We could plug the sign in, but we need fiber to go to there. And so that's one of the one-time things. You're going to need fiber to wire all of those rail stations together to feed better real-time information and improve wayfinding. So that's sort of the capital side of things. And there are a number of examples going throughout the systems that you would take to do that, to do BRT. That's going to take a capital investment to put that in place to give the bus priority on a public street, whether it's in Woodstock or in Naperville or in downtown Chicago. All of that costs money And that's a capital investment. And so I think it's, as Daniel said, this is round numbers. I'm giving you a little bit more specifics that hopefully you will understand and pick up on. But that's the kind of thing. Those are examples of what that capital cost would be. Some of it is one time and some of it is need for it on an annual basis going in. But as Lynette said, there's a large capital backlog as well. This is not intended to address that large capital backlog.
And I think to your point, and I think that that's it really, why we needed to make sure that this was in here, as we understand that this is ultimately going to the state legislature and to the governor. And there's a lot of things on that what we get list that look really good. And people will be interested in them, and they're already passing legislation to have different things happen, but they have a cost to them. And so what we want to make sure is that we're talking about all of the fun things on the right-hand side, that we're being very realistic about what that's going to take. And so it doesn't, it's an add-on, but I think it's important for people when they get this to know that there's an add-on to this, that it's not, those things aren't coming for free. And that they have these other needs to them, kind of like we've talked about with the fair mandates, right? If you have the legislature asking for these things that improve the system, which is wonderful, but there's a cost to that. And so we want to make sure that we really capture that. So understanding it is on top.
My question is, just so I understand, where would, in this example, the transition to electric buses, for instance, and the transformational investment piece, where does that fall in the capital request? Because at some point you're going to trigger a need to, say, build a new garage because you need more vehicles to run the extra service that's identified in there. So how does that fall into the mix?
Yeah, so I think I'll take that in two parts. Certainly expansions of service beyond the level that the service boards can currently operate at, with your garages and your fleet vehicles and your facilities is one of the things that would require additional capital expenses. And that's why that capital figure on transformational investment could get larger. And that's the sort of thing that if you really want to provide more service, you need more vehicles and more garages and more places to park and to maintain them. Bus electrification and sort of transit electrification more generally, I think is a challenging topic to address in the context of this report. And it is one that, we've talked about. It's certainly something that we know that the U and that CTA are committed to advancing as part of your shift to no emissions vehicles. And so I think this is a topic that we'll talk about briefly in the report. It's not included explicitly here as a new item to pursue through this, because we're really prioritizing returning service levels and making that the immediate focus within the part report. But understanding, and we can talk with you and your colleagues about how to position this, what the capital implications would be and sort of what the impacts on service levels would be if we were to accelerate or be asked to accelerate the electrification of the fleet.
Other input on the revenue packages. I think it's just, I was going to say that then it's important to note too, is that our next TC meeting is between the release of the draft recommendations and the vote on the draft recommendation. So we'll have more information on all of these as we move forward, but it'll be after, the next TC meeting is after that piece. Okay, well then we'll keep moving. Thanks, Daniel. If we thought tax revenue and is fun, let's talk about governance. So continue on how to implement it. As again, we've been talking with all of you throughout this process. Governance was one of the mandated topics in the legislation that we take a look at. And like, again, we do here at CMAP, we took a very analytical research approach to this. It's really starting with, what is the problem statement? I keep saying it's kind of like a phase one. What's the purpose and need? Why are we doing this? What are the problems we're trying to solve? So we spent time doing that. We did case studies, research surveys to get more information. We started doing some recommendations of governance models and what the pros and cons. And right now we are moving on to the refinement and then going on to final recommendations. Next slide. What we've heard throughout this process, kind of across the board, is that there were a few things that we needed to kind of make sure that we incorporated into all of this. One, again, is that the funding allocations within our transit system really need to meet with regional goals, that it makes sense to centralize it's some transit functions like fare policy and additional financial stewardship. We need to have regional perspectives on the regional boards. We need to make sure that there are ways for local input to be part of the process on any of the governance structures, that those people that are at the forefront of who the riders are in their areas want to make sure that they have a voice in this. And that, again, obviously the 50% fare box recovery ratio needed to be re-looked at, either to lessen or remove. So we're still looking at that. So when we talked last time, we were looking at some different options. We're down to kind of the strengthen the regional entity and keep the service boards, or integrating the service boards into one regional agency. And we have, next slide, looking at 4 options. So 2 within the strengthening the regional entity and 2 within the integrating service board. So I'm going to talk a little about all of these and where we are with them. So in the first option, we call it the stronger coordinating agency. You see that there are some different tasks and functions that would now live at the regional entity, most specifically fair policy. And then we have some information on more financial stewardship and oversight. Next slide. I'm going backwards here. In this slide, we're calling a regional network manager. There are several other functions that move to the regional entity. So leadership and capital planning, more authority to allocate operational funding, conducts regional service planning and coordination. And with each of these, the service boards primarily focuses on transit operations and day-to-day service planning decisions, while their boards kind of operate as a corporate board to oversee different functions of each of those entities. So those are the 2. I'm going to stop there for 1 second. Are there questions on these? These are the 2 where the regional entity has different functions and responsibilities, or more functions and responsibilities, but the service boards all still exist and function on transit operations. Focus. All right, I'm going to keep going. I'm guessing there'll be questions. Just wanted to make sure. So in this option, the service boards become operating units within a regional agency, and they focus exclusively on day-to-day service delivery. The agency is overseen by one regional board, and their operating units represented by committees. And the 4th option is an entirely new structured entity, where you have operating units that kind of go more along the modes, and the transit system is fully centralized under one board. As I mentioned, we've shared these options with the steering committee. Last week, got some, oh, wait, stay on that one. We got some input from them about all of the options. We are spending a lot of time, again, out and about trying to share this information, get input. Again, I keep saying it's like a 3-legged stool of conversations. We have the steering committee, which are all non-elected, non-operators. They are from the legislation, business, labor, advocacy, academia. And then we have the MPO, which you are all familiar with, our policy board, and then our actual board for CMAP. So we really want to make sure we're taking in input from all of those different entities as we move forward. Again, we're continuing to work with Eno, our third-party vendor, about what are pros and cons to each of these. And I spend more time having those conversations throughout the region as we would bring draft recommendations to the board and MPO in September. Now, thoughts or questions on these 4 options?
Amy?
Just a little bit of contextualization around the governance discussion, right? So I think it's important for us to understand that keeping our eyes on the prize, what we're trying to do is solve transit's funding issues. The reason why we're talking about governance largely here is to make sure that if we are envisioning sort of a new future for transit, for it to operate and function differently than what we've seen pre-pandemic, and when we're looking at sort of a new infusion of funding, do we need to position ourselves differently to really be more successful in executing that new future? Are there things in our governance structure today that are somehow hindering us to achieving that future? So That's just something to bear in mind as we consider these governance options.
There's a lot of information, Laura.
Oh, I'm
Loaded
sorry.
On those
Again,
four
it's
slides.
sprints
Still
instead of
washing
marathons,
over
sorry.
me. It probably is for everyone else. Mike,
So I'll just comment on some of the differences between these two. I'm the chief planning officer for CTA. So I do strategic planning, long-range planning and capital project planning, as well as do day-to-day service planning. And so both of those are in my shop. One of the, and I think you have to go back to get to where the regional service planning, there would be, and you'd have daily transit operating. Essentially, one of these or one of the alternatives would be to split my shop. And the strategic planning part of my shop, the long-range planning, the large capital project planning side of it would be in the regional organization. And then within CTA still would be the day-to-day service planning. And frankly, in my shop, they're about the same size. And I'm probably sharing information that you don't know or whatever, but I think giving you an example of how this would work or how this would split is probably good for your information to know about it. Frankly, that was the way that CTA was structured from 2006 to 2010. And so I ran the service planning side, the day-to-day planning, wrote the bus schedules, wrote the train schedules, did the day-to-day service planning side of things, but did not do the long-term strategic planning that became joined together back in 2009. And I became then the chief planning officer to handle both sides of that house. So does it scare me to think that we would split that? Frankly, I'm a professional and I think it would go on as it needs to go on, and it would work under either alternative. I don't think that that's a fatal flaw, that you can't do that, you can't do that. But is it better for the region? And that's a good question. And I think it's still an open question. I don't have an answer to that question. But that's sort of a practical result of doing something like this, would be to take that day-to-day service planning aspect of who decides, does the bus come every 7.5 minutes or does it come every 8 minutes or, whatever? And is it a 40-foot bus or is it a 60-foot bus when it comes by, based on the ridership levels and that kind of thing? That's the local service planning side that would, at least under one of these, stay within the service boards. But then the larger decision about building a bus garage or what is the next capital project? Do we extend the red line south? What is the next project after that? Do we extend the orange line to Ford City? Do we go back to extending the blue line from O'Hare underneath the airport and out the other side to Schaumburg, which is one of the old New Start projects that's still back in the background, but has potential to be dusted off and carried out, or extend the blue line from Forest Park, where it ends now, out to Oak Brook. And again, that's another New Start project or a line extension project. And Metra has their own examples of line extension. That's the long range planning. And that would happen at the regional level rather than within the agencies themselves. So is that good? Is it bad? It's different. I'm not in a position to tell you that it's good or bad, but I thought I'd give you a specific example of what potentially would happen. Does it scare me to think about it? No, it doesn't scare me. It's what scares me is that $730 million fiscal cliff that Amy referred to. Why are we doing this? We're looking at this. We're looking at our governance structure and possibly realigning the governance structure for the good of the region. That's what it's all about ultimately.
great examples, Mike. Thank you.
I was just gonna say, I think that's really helpful, Mike, and part of the reason that we want to have these discussions in different forums and be out because and you can see them they're posted on the website. We put the interview summaries up there as well as the case studies that Eno pulled together, because a lot of the question we get is like, well, what's the best structure? What's the best way for this to be done? And the reality is that people are doing it differently all over the country, all over the world, and there's pros and cons to each of those. So it is what is best for us, like what works best for our region and to meet the goals that we want. So that's why it's important for us to get input of what are the pros and cons? How do people look at it? And there's so many different layers, from the service to local input, that we've been getting information on that's really helpful for us in order to make an informed decision, because there isn't one best way to do this.
Actually, I guess what I'd like to do, and you talked about, input. One of the concerns as we go forward is what happens to, under these various versions, what happens to the boards? There's a CTA board that's appointed by the mayor and the governor. There's a PACE board. There's a Metro board that's separate. There's an RTA board. And all of those are composed of a combination of local elected officials, former local locally elected officials, and stakeholders in some cases, and professionals who have nothing to do with the transit industry. So what happens to those boards, and what happens to the ability of those boards to influence what goes on? So that the PACE board, for example, influences what happens with the PACE system and the decisions that are made. And the Metro board has that same role in that they are representing Cook County, suburban Cook, as well as the collar counties and the suburbs, and the city of Chicago. And they're all represented on all of those boards. What happens to those boards? What happens to the jostling? And it's a political issue, frankly. And all of you are, again, for the most part, you're professionals. And so you answer to elected officials in some way. And I think it's important for you to have that conversation with the elected officials or with your board members to talk about what's the practical aspect. I know that the RTA board, and I know that the Metro board have already had and the RTA board have already had discussions about this. What happens to us? What happens to the board members as we go forward? And again, I just go back to what Amy said, because I think it's the key to the whole discussion here is what's best for the region. And I don't know. I don't have the answer. I'm not a politician and I don't have all the political answers, but that practical reality is something that I wanted to bring out and put it on the table so that we talk about it, because all of you need to know that looms in the background as we go to make a decision about what the recommendation will be here for the region. Those political considerations are important, and how that gets solved. It may not get solved until it gets into the General Assembly down in Springfield, and that's what, a year and a half out or something like that. Anyway, so again, we, in some ways, will be powerless, but what gets put into the report will be important, and that's where we're kind of depending on CMAP to give us something good. And it's where your input, all of your input, is important too, directly to CMAP, but also in venues like this meeting. So, sorry, Laura.
Good insight into the dynamics. And I think that the slide that just got switched over here kind of highlights that there would be it's implied, I think, right, that there would be a different board, or it's stated, right? I think with option 3, it says RTA entity board with committee structure underneath, which would be staffed by professionals in their subject matter areas. So I think with each option here, there is some of those differences noted. So thank you for bringing that to our attention, Mike. Kyle.
I think the point you made is really important in terms of this is fundamentally a funding issue as a result of structural flaws in how we've funded transit operations for decades in the region. And that any governance changes are not linked to that structural funding issue, right? They can and should improve to achieve the transit future as you described. But so just when we're presenting this information to lawmakers and others, I think leading with that point is really important, because I think the structure of the project, how to implement it, suggests that these governance changes are necessary to close the shortfall for somebody who's not diving deep into this process. And I don't think that's accurate. If you look around the country, regions have very different governance structures, as you mentioned, Laura. And those are all a result of the local politics and the local geography in that region, as you were just talking about, Mike. What we all have in common, at least the big transit systems, are all facing structural operating deficits because travel habits changed during the pandemic and people were riding transit to work less frequently today than they were in 2019. That's a funding issue as a result of changes in behavior. It's not a governance issue, right? That's not to say that we shouldn't continue to explore and discuss changes to governance that can make our regional transit system better. But I think it's important to just frame that, just like you did at the start, Amy, appropriately in the context of the overall report, because I do really worry that people get the impression that the governance changes are linked to the operating deficit, and I don't think that's accurate.
Other questions, thoughts, comments? Loves, hates.
Go ahead, Chris.
I know on the governance side, I think some of the struggles we've had at DuPage and maybe some of the other entities is what is the representation on those boards or those, whether it's the regional board or a new service board? While I may disagree that the governance structure or the deficit we have definitely was accelerated by COVID, but there's huge deficits in the next 5 years that we didn't see in the prior 10 years. And so I know we look at those numbers and try to see the trends and what's doing that. And so I know we've talked on the capital side in our county that whatever we're doing in terms of investments, are we going to get a return in terms of improved service? And I don't know if that's capital, I don't know if that's operations, and I don't know if counties and professionals, this whole way, the state would be integrated in any of these governance structures.
I definitely think we're moving to, are there principles and thoughts about representation? Things, again, if you're having the state play a different role, there's other places that have the state be on different boards. So there's things like that that we want to keep exploring and flesh out so that we can have some thoughts, guiding principles that are part of that in here as well.
Yeah, just to expound on that, right? Governance is there's recognition that there's some synergies there around thinking about representation from agencies that may be providing new funding to transit, right? So if it is contemplated for greater state involvement in funding, we see value in involving the state more in those governing bodies as well as tollway too. So those things are also contemplated.
I can go to the next step slide. Again, what we are trying to do is post white papers, presentations, videos, whatever format we can get it in to get the information out. We're hoping by sometime next week or the week after that we have all of the presentations or white papers up on the website. So we're trying to move as fast as we can, like we said before. We're continuing to do outreach, go to board meetings, meet with different counties as much as we can over the course of the next few weeks, a month. We are still moving again to have our draft recommendations to the joint meeting of the board and MPO on September 13th, and then October 11th have a final vote. So quick moving in the next months to move this forward. In the meantime, again, either at this forum, one-on-one emails, however you want to share information with us or thoughts, we're really excited to get input through the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So it will be, the recommendations will be presented at the MPO board meeting on September 13th, you said?
Correct.
Okay, and our next meeting will be on the 22nd.
Correct. So we're not bringing it for a vote to TC.
Sure.
Sharing it with, but not going through the same voting structure you would for.
That's where I was going,
Yes.
exactly. So this, in terms of information and input, that's what this body is, providing as comments and input, but it will be presented to the MPO policy at September 13th, and then we will convene again and probably, I'm assuming, get an update?
Yes, absolutely.
Very good. Looking forward to it.
Great. I'm gonna stay up here for other business.
That's right. So thank you, Laura, for your presentation. So is there any other business that committee members would like to bring forward at this time?
It's not other business, just to go back to the SS4 agreement has a consultant or an RFP been issued and has a consultant been brought on board, or is it this agreement that you had to get executed first at the federal level and now you're going to go to that next step? Just trying to put a timeline in so that, because we're kind of following this, obviously, counties.
Yeah, I actually just read. So I feel like Lindsay might have a better, yeah.
Hi, Chris. We're going to be reaching out to each of the counties to set up a kickoff meeting. We selected the consultant AECom for the project management oversight of developing the 6 county plans, but we are going to be developing the scopes for each county plan to hopefully be posted by the end of August. And so look for a short calendar invite from me for next week. And Kane County is the lucky one that I got to first, but we'll be following up with the other counties shortly.
Thank you. We look forward to hearing from you. Laura.
I have a quick announcement more than other business. Some of you are staying for the IIJA workshop right after this at 11:30. So if we end early, we're not going to be starting until 11:30. So if people need rooms or breaks, let me know. But we are not going to be able to start early. So for those of you attending, it'll be DuPage County room just across the hall.
Right, that meeting will be next door as well. Okay, very good. Any other business? Okay. So does anyone from the audience wish to address the committee today? Where's Terry? There you are. We have no requests. Doug?
We did get a written comment that was submitted to the committee. And if it's all right, I'll read through it, or would you prefer I just summarize and send the letter to the members? About a page.
We have time. So we've got one.
All right.
Got one, we can read it.
So the comment was submitted by John Paul Jones, the president of Sustainable Inglewood Initiatives and the nature trail consultant with Grow Greater Inglewood. Today we're here, I'm reading it in the first person. Today we are here to witness staff recommendations for the FY 2024 to 2028 locally preferred transportation alternatives program. We are most pleased to see the Inglewood Nature Trail, described as the Inglewood Line Trail, recommended for funding, and look forward to providing a public comment at the scheduled 11th public hearing. We wish to share with the Transportation Committee our local excitement with the continual progress with the historic Green Line Racine Station. The Chicago Transit Authority continues to respond to the public's request to find funds toward the reopening of our local station. The CTA was recently awarded federal funding to perform community engagement with the area residents, riders, and organizations. This funding will allow for a more broader discussion on regional transportation, accessibility, and land use planning. On Wednesday, Grow Greater Inglewood and its Wisdom Council agreed to pursue a more intentional effort to plan for the entire eastern boundary of Inglewood, that the Dan Ryan Gateway points better serve as true gateways to the Greater Inglewood District. This was a major decision, and CMAP would be updated on this initiative. In addition, we hope to add comments on a host of other regional matters important to Greater Inglewood and its greater Southwest region related to climate change, intermodal stations, air monitoring, regional transportation, and public-private partnerships. To this end, thank you for your collective leadership, and we look forward to sharing ideas and information with you, with your working committee. That is it.
Thank you, Doug. And we have no one online, right, Terry? No one online either. Oh, thank you, Kama. Okay. All right, so the next meeting of this committee is scheduled for September 22nd. And seeing that there's no other business before the committee, do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, everyone.